Hi folks. Well, the end of the year is upon us, and it's been quite a crazy one in many ways for most of us. For me, it's been an interesting ride, especially on this channel. Aside from a few bumps and a little pauses here and there, I've actually managed to put out more reviews and videos this year than any year previously in the 6 years that I've been doing this. I'm also really glad that I managed to get these movies by month videos out, and that itself has been a bit of a crazy ride as well. I mean, I'm quite surprised rewatching some of these old ones now and again that I'd actually forgotten a lot of the films that I've actually seen this year. But now we're at the end of 2020, thank goodness, and all that's left is for me to give you a rundown of the films I've watched for the first time this December. So first up was a film called Schoolgirls. At least it's called that in the UK and in America. It was actually one I saw as part of the Catalan Film Festival I mentioned last month, and originally in Spanish it's actually called Las Niñas, which I think translates more like little girls rather than schoolgirls. And it's a drama set back in the early 90s in a small town somewhere in Spain, where this wee lassie called Celia, who's kind of a sheltered only child being raised by her constantly working single mum. And it's all about her getting gradually brought out of her shell when a new girl from the big city moves into town and befriends her. And it's a really interesting story. I mean, it's well done, it's well acted. It does suffer a little bit though from being kind of lacking in an actual plot, since really it's just kind of a lot of scenes of the characters going about their lives and the girls just acting out occasionally or getting up to mischief. But it's more of a mood piece, and it kind of works in that way, but I'd really only give it about a 3 out of 5, because frankly, I can imagine an awful lot of folk finding it a wee bit dull, particularly anybody who didn't grow up in that era. But I suppose anyone else, you're still going to find it broadly relatable, so yeah, it's an interesting film. Another film that I saw this month was called 71, as in 1971, and that's a movie about the Troubles. In the UK, we used to send an awful lot of British troops over to Belfast, ostensibly to keep the peace between the Nationalists and the Unionists, and it led to a lot of really bad times, and lots of people died, and it was pretty nasty. And the story of 71 is about a squad of really green recruits who get sent there, and then on day one they go out kind of unprepared and ill-equipped, and a bunch of bad stuff happens, leaving one of them left behind, and the rest of them go home. And most of the film is really set during this one really vicious and deadly night where this one guy is just stuck out there on his own. He's half beaten up, he's completely lost, but he's got the same IRA teenagers out looking for him that basically killed his pal, as well as at the same time you've got Sean Harris's crew of really corrupt undercover MI5 guys who are kind of looking to cover up their own mistake that led to a whole pub being blown up. And it's actually a really good film, it's really well made, and the actor who's in the lead, Jack O'Connell, he does an absolutely amazing job, as does Sean Harris, who, let's face it, Sean Harris is absolutely fantastic in just about everything. Even when he's in a legitimately bad film, he's still good. And I'd give this a 4 out of 5 easily. I'd definitely recommend it. I mean, if there's one issue, I'd say that there is a kind of vague and unclear subplot about the main guy's brother that's set back in the UK, and it only really comes in very briefly in the movie, and frankly, doesn't add much and doesn't really need to be there. But otherwise, this is an absolute cracker, really solid film with some fantastic performances. Another one of the Spanish Film Festival movies that I saw was called Josep, and that was an animated film all about this real-life artist and political cartoonist called Josep Bartoli, and how he had to live in a French concentration camp during the Spanish Civil War. And this is a really interesting film because I honestly knew pretty much nothing about the French internment camps or about how that related to like the Nazi Holocaust camps and stuff. That was just something I didn't really know much about. And understandably, it's kind of a dark story. I mean, I know a little bit about the Spanish Civil War, but the thing is, this is kind of a short film. It's kind of quirky. And if you don't know much about the guy, some of the artistic choices are a bit bizarre in the film because apparently it ties into like his style of work at that time. I only found that out later after I watched the movie and wondered why some parts were animated really well and some parts were almost like still frames. It's a 3 out of 5 movie, not because it's bad, just because it's kind of middle of the road. It's something I'm definitely happy to have seen, but it's definitely not one that's for everybody. But if you are interested in any of the topics about that I've mentioned, then yeah, check it out. Moving on to another film, one that I saw was Mythica, A Quest for Heroes. And this is a film totally in the same vein as stuff like Willow or Lord of the Rings, but if you aim way lower down like, the budget and quality ladder to more like stuff like the Dungeons & Dragons movies.
Let the blood rain from the sky!
And it's all about this apprentice sorcerer lassie who used to work for the guy off Hercules, but when things get bad he splits out of town and sends her off into the world to find her fortune and get embroiled in quests and such like. I would definitely say though that Mythica is actually more fun to watch than the Dungeons & Dragons films. it really is just this classic role-playing campaign sort of story. You know, anyone who knows anything about like pen and paper, rolling dice, role-playing will have probably played a game like this with, you know, it's the usual group of folk, all different types of character types, and they're all out to get treasure, save the kingdom, etc, etc. But in a weird way, this is kind of a fun movie. It's kind of silly and goofy, but it's daft, harmless fun, and there was a little bit of charm about it. And clearly it was kind of popular with some audience somewhere, because they made about 4 more of these movies, and yeah, they all seem to have gotten an okay write-up. So yeah, if you're into things like The Witcher and Lord of the Rings and you thought, I kind of want to watch more of this, but I'm not really fussed about wanting to watch anything deep or thinking too hard about it, yeah, this is one for you. Totally acceptable 3 out of 5 adventure movie. In a slightly different vein, another film I saw, if you can call it that, was Cyberlante. And the reason I say that is because this is actually more like a crowd-funded indie amateur movie, and you can tell that from the fact that it's barely over an hour long, and because online there's actually more videos from the makers asking for money and talking about the project than there is actually for trailers or actual punters talking about the movie. And because of that, I will forgive it a lot of stuff, because, you know, it's a passion project done on the cheap by a bunch of pals, and even still though. It's all about this guy who's a really great hacker apparently, but he's trying sort of to go straight by getting a job or various jobs in this weird hotel. It's not very clear. But then he realises that the manager's like sort of an evil murderer of ex-girlfriends, so he starts hacking in everybody's phones and laptops and watching the women the guy's dating and stalking, and it's kind of a mess, and even at 85 minutes it feels a bit too long and meandery and doesn't make a huge amount of sense. There's also a kind of weird subplot about his best mate being like the sort of consigliere to this gangster who has a big house and an obsession with toy cars. And look, I watched it and I still don't understand this movie, so yeah, 2 out of 5. You might actually have more fun running your antivirus software and computer than watching this, but it's not the worst thing in the world. But I would probably do it a wee skip and not bother. And here's one that I picked for one of my Friday night film nights, and that was a western called The Burrowers. Now, I went into this kind of hoping it was going to be a movie, something like Tremors, or if not, then, because it was a western, something a bit more like Bone Tomahawk, never mind. And in some ways, I was kind of right about the latter part, since both movies are basically about somebody being kidnapped by the engines, or so they think, and then it turns out to be way more complicated than that when they look into it. But in The Burrowers, instead of being an interesting exploration of characters while on a daring rescue mission, it's about these guys who spend half the movie following what they think, and what the audience already knows is the wrong lead, while the guy who played Toombs from the X-Files goes around doing racism on everybody and murdering Native Americans left, right and centre. And the thing is, this is a monster movie, and you work out that back basically from the front scene, but the characters don't have a clue about that for a long, long time, which gets a little bit frustrating and kind of dull for great swathes of the story. And it's kind of a shame, because there's kind of a germ of a decent idea inside this film, and actually there's also some really grim, dark story stuff that might actually stick with you long past the ending of this movie, only the movie plays that stuff kind of more for jokes rather than the actual horror. So yeah, 2 out of 5. I'd say you're definitely better off watching Tremors, or definitely better off watching Bone Tomahawk if you want a proper Western horror, because this just ain't the one. Another film I saw, which actually had Jack O'Connell, the guy from 71 in it, was Trial by Fire. And this was a real-life drama story. And while in 71 he barely spoke at all, he was a really taciturn sort of character, in this he literally never shuts up, because he's this kind of crazy redneck layabout, Cameron Willingham, who is a real person who was sent to jail for murder when his house caught fire and his 2 kids died in the blaze. And the film follows him all through his trial, all through the prison system, and then after a chance encounter, his friendship with Laura Dern, who's a playwright who gets involved with his appeal process. And it's a pretty depressing film, but really interesting, which is probably what you'd expect from Ed Zwick. I mean, that was the director, and who's the same guy who made Glory, which is the Civil War movie, and also made The Last Samurai. But this really felt like a bit of a workmanlike effort from him, and it is interesting, but it's still probably only about a 3 out of 5 movie. I mean, it's not one that's going to blow you away, but it might make you actually stop and think about the problems in some of the court and law systems in some states in America. As to something made a wee bit more locally, I also saw a horror movie this month called Death of a Vlogger. Now, this is kind of a fun wee film because it's a pretty low-budget indie movie shot in Glasgow by a handful of folk. And it's all about this character called Graham, who's played by Graham Hughes, who also wrote and directed the movie. And he's a vlogger, funnily enough. And he thinks that his flat's haunted, so he makes a handful of viral videos that, funnily enough, they go viral, and he ends up getting involved with this kind of ghost hunter, Zach Bagans kind of guy.
Let's hunt some motherfucking ghosts.
And then a professional debunker, and things start to slightly spiral out of control. Now, this is a mystery film, so I don't want to actually spoil the mystery of it, but what really worked for me about this is that by the end, I genuinely was kind of still scratching my head in a good way. I mean, basically, this is not the film you're expecting from the very beginning of it, and in fact, at various points during the film, you'll be surprised because it'll take a turn and not be the film that you think it's going to be and the film that you thought you were actually watching. Yeah, what I will say is the middle act of the movie, though, is a little bit naff, which lets it down a little bit. So yeah, that's why I would only give it 3 out of 5. It's also because it's a horror film and it's not really that scary, and most of the scares you would probably also spot a mile off. Still, considering it was made for probably about a handful of change, it's worth checking out, especially if you like found footage horror movies or sort of mockumentary stuff. And on the more art house side of things, I also saw a classic French art house movie called Mouchette. And this was like an old film from like the 1950s or the 1960s, all about this wee lassie who has a pretty awful time of it being a poor wee waif with a sick mum, an alcoholic dad and no money, and a pretty rubbish life. And she ends up in a really bad situation when she gets caught up in a love triangle between the local poacher, the gamekeeper and the barmaid. It all gets a bit weird and a bit strange, but it's really interestingly made, and like most arty things, it's quite subjective and quite confusing, and it totally isn't for everybody. But I kind of like that sort of thing, and I'd give it a total 4 out of 5 because it kept me guessing what was going on right up until the end and kept taking loads of little twists and turns throughout the storyline. And after it's finished, I've been thinking about it every now and again ever since. So yeah, well worth checking out. And you know, you could always tell your mates you saw it and they might think you're clever. And continuing the foreign film thing, the last movie I saw this year, just at the end of the month, was a Russian sci-fi action movie called The Blackout, which is all about the world after a weird alien attack kills off all the power and most of the people outside of a big chunk of Eastern Europe. And all that leaves is essentially the Russians and what's left of their army to try and figure out what happened, and prepare to face off against whatever weird things are hiding out in the darkness, and whatever might have caused it. And it's actually a surprisingly good film with decent performances, including the guy from Sputnik that I watched back in August. And really, it's kind of a great blend of action, story, and pretty decent special effects and stunt work, and even though the story itself does feel like the plot of some old computer game or other, but it also felt like it was drawing an awful lot of visual references from films like Full Metal Jacket and Black Hawk Down, like proper war films. And I appreciate that this is kind of a Russian answer to the film Battle Los Angeles, you know, the American one, which was all about the aliens invading, funnily enough, Los Angeles. But this is actually a much better film, although it is kind of cheesy. But honestly, I ended up really liking the characters and really enjoyed the story, so I'd give it a 4 out of 5, with the proviso that it is only trying to be a great Friday popcorn movie and a bit of sci-fi fun. Nothing terribly serious, and certainly a bit more of a boys' own adventure soldier film than a lot of the stuff I've watched. So that's that. And will I continue making any movie by month videos in 2021? I don't know, I haven't decided yet. I might end up shaking the format up a wee bit, I might continue it. But it is occasionally a little bit of a slog to do these, although it's not like it isn't fun. It also means I can look back and see all these movies that I saw in a year, which is kind of a strange nostalgia trip, as I mentioned earlier on. But in any case, no matter what I decide, and no matter what other videos I'm covering, I'd just like to wish you all a very happy new year, and I really honestly hope that 2021 is great for everyone and better than 2020's been. So yeah, lots of love from me, and until next year, these have been my grumpy opinions. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.